Hey Star Trek fans, welcome back to another edition of the Star Trek Lower Decks Deep Dive. This week we are taking a look at the Easter eggs, canon connections, and continuity bits for the second episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, Envoys. So without further ado, let's jump right in and take a look at some of the Easter eggs that I caught in this week's episode. Starting out with the teaser of the episode, we see an energy creature invading the USS Cerritos. This is another Star Trek trope that we've seen in many episodes before. Most notably, visually, this reminds me of the energy creature from the episode The Child that impregnated Deanna Troi, and also a little bit of the energy creature from the Season 5 TNG episode Imaginary Friend, which ended up taking the form of the imaginary friend of a young girl living aboard the Enterprise. The teaser ends with the captain musing that she should come up with something cool to say when they go to warp, settling on the possible contender of "it's warp time." That's not bad, but although he wasn't the first to use this expression when going to warp, nothing will ever beat Jean-Luc Picard's rendition of the famous
"Engage."
Although runner-up shoutouts do have to be given to Pike's "Hit It" and Alt Pike's "Punch It." When the episode proper begins, we learn that Boimler has been assigned to escort a Klingon general to negotiations at the Federation Embassy. Mariner makes the joke that all Klingon names sound the same, and nearly all of them have a random apostrophe in them for some reason. Not to be a total nitpicker, but there are many Klingon names without an apostrophe in them, and these ones are just off the top of my head. We have Worf, Chang, Martok, Kor, Kang, Koloth, Kern, Moog, Duras, Clag, Chorus, Conmel, Gorkon, Kurla, Azetbur. I'm sure there are many, many more. Does Alexander count? For this next one, I'm going to jump around the episode a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about Shuttlecraft. We learn in this episode that the shuttlecraft assigned to the USS Cerritos are Type 6A shuttlecraft. They do look slightly different from the Type 6 shuttlecraft that we've seen in Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Voyager. If we look at that early scene in the ensign's work area, we see several Type 6 shuttlecraft engines leaning up against the wall. We also get another name for one of the shuttlecraft of the Cerritos. We see only a partial name here, but this would appear to be the shuttlecraft Kings Canyon, once again named for a national park in the state of California. When we get down to the planet, we see several interesting shuttlecraft in the background. The first is this almost TOS-style Galileo shuttlecraft. This is very similar to the shuttlecraft that we see in Star Trek the original series, but with a slightly different front viewport configuration. We also see a couple of the aforementioned Type 6 shuttlecraft in the background of the scene. And finally, there is also this shuttlecraft, which looks to be based on the design of the air tram from Star Trek the Motion Picture. There are a few differences, but it looks as though the basic design was taken from that vehicle. In preparation for his mission to escort General Kurin, Boimler tries out his formal Klingon greetings and uses the Klingon greeting of Nukne. Nukne in Klingon literally means, "What do you want?" and is about as polite as Klingons get. This one's a nice little attention to detail Easter egg here. We briefly see the engineering tool that Rutherford is using while realigning the conduits on the Cerritos, and we see it as very similar to an engineering tool used throughout the TNG era of Star Trek, most usually by Chief O'Brien on Deep Space Nine. Boimler pulls out all of the stops for this mission to escort the general, including wearing a dress uniform. We see here the design of the dress uniforms of this era of Star Trek, and it's a bit of a return to the older style of dress uniforms used in Star Trek The Next Generation. The most recent iteration had been this white uniform used in Star Trek Insurrection, Star Trek Nemesis, and Deep Space Nine. However, these new uniforms seem to return to the longer type that we see in TNG. Once we get to the surface of Telgana 4, we see this kind of hub between the various districts that make up the main city that we see here. And it may just be me, but this hub looks an awful lot like Farpoint Station, seen in the TNG pilot episode Encounter at Farpoint. Let's take a moment here to catalog the various alien races that we see populating the background of this episode. There are quite a few, so let's jump right in. We see a few representatives of the Evora, which were an alien race from Star Trek Insurrection. They were from the delegation that Picard was meeting with at the start of that film. We also see Bolians, a staple of background TNG-era Star Trek. These aliens would appear to be Arcturians from Star Trek the Motion Picture. These are one of the alien races that have never been really seen close up in detail on screen, but were populating the background of that film. We also see benzites. Again, those were introduced in Star Trek The Next Generation. There are, of course, a number of species that I personally can't identify and maybe one-off creations for this series. However, there are still others. I'm pretty sure this is a Lurian. That's Morn's people from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. We also see another one in the fight with the Andorians. Speaking of Andorians, we do see a lot of them in this episode, of course. We have these strange centaur-type aliens in the background. Again, these are unfamiliar to me, but maybe unique creations. However, over here we do see an alien that appears to be a Skor, or possibly an Aurelian from Star Trek the Animated Series. Called out directly are these Kalons. They were introduced in the TNG episode Half a Life. You may remember Timicin, who fell in love with Lwaxana Troi. Back on the Cerritos, we have the Napian crew member that we've seen before, and in this scene here, possibly an Antaran. Antarans were introduced in the Enterprise episode The Breach as a species that had fought several wars with the Denobulans. And finally, my favorite species call out from this episode, we see a Vendorian from the animated series episode The Survivor. Vendorians are a shapeshifter species, and we see one being attacked here by the Andorians. General Corinne spends the trip to the planet getting rather drunk, and we see the remnants of that, including blood wine bottles, a ducktog, a batleth, blood wine flagons, and barrels. All of these have been seen in previous Star Trek series before. Mariner references Raktajino. Raktajino is a Klingon coffee introduced in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Captain Benjamin Sisko was rather fond of the beverage. The Starfleet Black Ops Group Section 31 is referenced by Boimler when talking about his speedwalking, saying that it is a technique employed by the secretive organization to conserve energy. I really want to see the training video where they teach that technique. In their shenanigans on Telgana 4, Boimler fears that they may be in violation of the Kitimura Accords. The Kitimura Accords are the original peace treaty between the Federation and the Klingon Empire signed in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. The Klingons subsequently pulled out of the Kitimura Accords nearly a century later in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. However, Gowron re-signed the Kitimura Accords at the behest of Captain Sisko when they were facing a greater threat from the Dominion. Here are some more Klingon references in this episode. We, of course, see Gach, which is the famous living serpent worm dish served in Klingon restaurants and aboard Klingon ships. We see a Mek'leth, which is a smaller sword than the Batleth and one that Worf was fond of using in Deep Space Nine and most famously in Star Trek First Contact. We see these display cases selling various Klingon weapons, including Klingon disruptors from the original series, the movie era, and early Star Trek The Next Generation. Also for sale are various Klingon armor and uniforms. Back on the ship, Rutherford is trying his hand at various different departments around the ship, including command. He is getting evaluated in his command abilities by the first officer, Commander Ransom, who says that he will enjoy the firm hot pulse of a joystick in his hand. I believe this is a roundabout reference to Star Trek Insurrection, when we saw Riker use the manual control column to control the Enterprise, which oddly enough looked like a fairly common joystick that you might pick up at Radio Shack. Also referenced in this scene is the Janeway Protocol as a suggested course of action for Rutherford to take when facing a temporal anomaly. It's not clear exactly what the Janeway Protocol is, however, I have seen speculation online that it involves just ramming your way through something like Janeway was wont to do with the Voyager on several occasions. In one simulation, Rutherford manages to get all of the kids aboard the simulated Cerritos killed. This is, of course, a reference to the fact that starships in the TNG era, especially the Galaxy class, have families and children aboard as a regular part of their complement. When Rutherford tries his hand at the security department, we see the security chief, Lieutenant Shax, say, "In the name of the prophets." Shax is, of course, a Bajoran, and the prophets are the gods that are worshipped by the people of that planet. In fact, wormhole aliens who live in the nearby Bajoran wormhole, and who have influenced events on Bajor such that they have come to be praised as deities. Back on Telgana 4, Boimler and Mariner have made their way to the Rysian district. In this, we see several callbacks to previous episodes that involved Risa, including the ubiquitous Horrigon, which indicates that someone is wanting Jamaharon. We also see several costumes in the background that we have seen before on the pleasure planet of Risa. Next up is the Andorian district of the planet. We see wall details that remind me of wall details we've seen on Andorian ships in Star Trek Enterprise. When a bar fight breaks out, we also see one member of this species wielding an Ushan Tor, an ice miner's tool, which was introduced in the 4th season of Enterprise. We get this overhead shot of the city on Telgana 4. If you look, there are various logos denoting the districts that we see, including Ferengi, Romulan, and Federation logos. Also, take a look at these rock formations. Do they look at all familiar to you? This might be some indication that the rock formations that make up the Vasquez rocks in California are very common on planets that are explored in Star Trek. We have, of course, seen them before in many episodes of Star Trek, the original series, TNG, and elsewhere. Boimler and Mariner come across this Ferengi, who's acting in a very stereotypical manner, and even is utilizing the mannerisms and costuming of the infamous Ferengi from the 1st season of Star Trek The Next Generation. However, we learn later in the episode that this Ferengi is much more like the more cultured Ferengi that we see in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. However, Boimler allows his racism to come into full force here when describing the Ferengi. Unfortunately, this is not an attitude that is completely unknown elsewhere in Starfleet, including from some of our favorite characters such as Riker and Tom Paris.
Didn't they warn you about Ferengi at the Academy?
So there you have it, folks. Those are the Easter eggs and canon connections that I caught in this week's episode of Lower Decks. Were there any that I missed? Please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Thanks, of course, as always, to the Patreon supporters whose help is invaluable in bringing these videos to you. I really do appreciate it. Even $1 a month really does help in bringing these videos to you each week. And I cannot thank you enough. To everyone else, thank you so much for watching. I really, truly do appreciate that as well. And if you thought this video was worth it, a like, share, and subscribe would be very helpful. Share this with someone you think might enjoy these videos, who's watching and enjoying Lower Decks and likes kind of a positive commentary on these episodes. Thank you so much for subscribing to Kertrats Productions. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, as always, live long and prosper.